Hello, folks. Welcome back from break. Today is the 12th of April, and as I just mentioned, we just got back from break, which means we're going to take today to just wrap up a little bit of the lesson that we had started before break. We had started working on our distributive property, if you guys remember. And as a reminder of what the distributive property is, it's if I have a number being multiplied by something in parentheses, I can distribute that number into those parentheses and multiply it by each of the parts. For example, if I had 5 times 2 plus 3, well, luckily for me, I know how to just solve this without using my distributive property. I do 2 plus 3 equals 5, and then 5 times 5 would give me 25. Using my distributive property, what that would tell me to do would be take this 5, multiply it by my first number, and then multiply it by my second number. So I'd have 5 times 2 plus 5 times 3. 5 times 2 gives me 10. 5 times 3 gives me 15. And you look at that, I get the same answer of 25. So, of course, as you can see, this problem here that I used as an example, well, we could have solved that without using the distributive property. What's the point of the distributive property? Well, the distributive property can help us when we have, excuse me, when we're going to be dealing with much larger numbers, so we can deal with our multiplication first. And it also helps us when we have things like variables. Of course, nothing we're working with right now has any variables in it, doesn't have any letters, but maybe in the future we might run into something like that. So we want to get prepared so that you guys know what the distributive property is now, so that later in the future, if we have to use it, we know how to use it. Example 3 says, hey, use the distributive property to multiply rational numbers. Now, this one's a little bit strange because we have 16 times negative 3/8 plus 16 times 1/4. And, well, that's not in our form that we had before. It's not at all like this. This actually looks more like our second form. Well, here's the thing. We can actually take our distributive property and go backwards. We can start with something like this and go backwards to this 5 parentheses 2 plus 3. Similar to the distributive property, it's actually something called factoring. So we notice that both of these sides are being multiplied by a 16. So that means that the number on the outside of my parentheses is going to be a 16. And on the inside of my parentheses, I'm going to have negative 3/8 plus the 1/4 that I have over here. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, it's so that we don't need to multiply by fractions twice. We can get rid of our fractions and only have one fraction and then multiply it. So I have negative 3/8 plus 1/4. If I were to make them have a common denominator and add them together, I would have negative 1/8. And now I'm only going to have to do multiplication with a fraction once. So I'm going to have 16 times negative 1/8, which will be negative 16/8, or negative 2. There's my answer here. So, our distributive property, we could either distribute our 5 in, or we could pull our 5 out. We could either distribute our 16 in, or we can pull that 16 out, just like we did here. So both of them were multiplied by 16. That means I could add together these two parts and multiply that by 16. The last thing that we'll be working on in this video is going to be example form. Using our multiplicative inverse to rewrite division as multiplication. Hopefully, we remember a little bit about our multiplicative inverse. I believe we went over this either in the last unit or the unit before that. That being said, obviously, it's been a little bit of time since we went over what our multiplicative inverse is. So, what it has here is it has, hey, rewrite our expression as only multiplication and then evaluate. Wants us to take this problem. We can see we have division here, and we have division here. And it wants us to rewrite this as only multiplication. Luckily, this is a little bit of review for us. The multiplicative inverse says, hey, if I'm dividing by a fraction, I don't like dividing by fractions. It's not something I want to do. So I'm going to do something called our multiplicative inverse. And if you remember, inverse means the opposite. It's not going to be the same as the opposite in terms of addition goes to subtraction or positive goes to negative. Our multiplicative inverse is, instead of going negative to positive, positive to negative, what we do is we take our fraction. So, for example, if I had 1/2, my multiplicative inverse says, hey, take that and flip it upside down. Put it on its head. It's going to be 2 over 1, or just 2. So if I'm dividing by a fraction, it says, hey, don't divide by a fraction. That's not something you want to do. Instead of dividing by a fraction, you can multiply by the inverse of that fraction. Multiply by that fraction flipped upside down. So instead of dividing by 2/3, well, what are we going to multiply by? We're going to multiply by, well, take this and flip it upside down. Denominator becomes the numerator, numerator becomes the denominator, and I have, well, let's look at that, 3/2 times -8 times 3 times, oh, well, we're dividing, so we're going to change it to multiplication. I don't want to use both dots and x's here. I want to use one or the other, so I'm going to use the x multiplication. So I'm going to flip this. Well, if 1/2 becomes 2 over 1, which is 2, negative 1/2 is going to become -2. And would you look at that? We have it all as multiplication. It's going to be much easier for us to do than dividing by fractions. So what we can do is, again, if you remember back earlier in this lesson, as a reminder, I can actually rearrange this however I want. Because right now I have this 3/2. I don't want any fractions. I want to get rid of fractions as soon as possible. So if I have 3/2 here, to get rid of this 2 in the denominator, I'm going to have to multiply it by something like a 2. Hey, would you look at that? There's a -2 right there. It's not the same as a 2, but it'll still get the job done. So if I want to take these two and multiply them together first, I'm going to do exactly that. My 1 times, well, here's the good news. Multiplying anything by 1, it doesn't matter. It's going to be the same. So we can actually get rid of this immediately. So I'm going to have my -8 times 3, and then I have 3/2 times -2, that's going to be -3. And then we can do our 3 and our negative 3. So I have negative 8 times negative 9. And then negative 8 times negative 9. That's the same as 8 times 9. Which is going to give me 72 as an answer. Now, of course, some might say, well, why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do really any of that? We could have just done it normally. We didn't need to do any of this rearranging. We didn't need to do any of this multiplicative inverse stuff. And, we didn't have to. You're right. What we could have done is we could have solved this without having to do any of our multiplicative inverse stuff. That being said, it's easier if you do. If you are going to solve this without like a calculator or anything, it's easier for you to solve it by using these methods that we have. So with that, that's going to be the end of this video. Your responsibility is to do that last exercise. That's right below example 4. I believe that's exercise 6. And then the problem set is also going to be up to you to finish. With that, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I will see you guys tomorrow. Farewell.